I love Half-Life Alyx. You know, it's a game that, with a surface inspection, doesn't actually seem all that impressive. Graphically speaking, it looks pretty nice, but when you look a little bit closer, it's clear the corners that are being cut to run in VR. Mechanically speaking, it's kind of basic, a mix of standard combat and puzzles, and narratively speaking, it's not the most interesting or thematic stories ever told. But while it may not be complex, it is solidly built. The fundamental design of the game is fantastic, and most importantly, it is paced excellently. Many games struggle with pacing, even Valve's own titles can drag in places, but no game is paced as smoothly as Half-Life Alyx. It's probably helped by its shorter runtime, that naturally makes things easier, but there is so much going on in the game's structure to make what could feel like 21 disjointed maps feel like one cohesive experience. Everyone knows about the 11 chapters that the game is split into: Engagement, the Quarantine Zone, Is or Won't Be, Super Weapon, the Northern Star, Arms Race, Jeff, Captivity, Revelations, Breaking and Entering, and Point Extraction. However, those are just names given to delineate different locations and sections of the game. They aren't actually used to construct the game's pacing. The game is actually internally separated into 5 separate acts, and we know this because each map is prefixed with the act it belongs to. Act 1 is the introduction up until getting on the train, Act 2 is everything in the subway tunnels and up to the train crash, Act 3 is from the subway station right up until the end of Jeff, Act 4 is everything beyond that point up until just before entering the vault, and Act 5 is everything inside the vault. There are a couple interesting things here. First off, is that these acts are pretty lopsided. Acts 1 and 5 only have 2 maps each, and Act 5's second map is just the ending cutscene, whereas Act 3 spans 4 entire chapters. The second thing is that anyone who knows about act structure knows that there should really only be 3 acts: the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. Okay, I'm gonna clear up that last point first, because yeah, traditionally film act structure is delineated into 3 acts, but there are other definitions of act structure that split it into 5 acts, and there is even redefinitions of the traditional 3-act structure that splits it into something that has 5 acts, but either way, any kind of traditional act structure is only going to loosely map onto a game, because a game has different needs than any kind of media that traditional act structures were defined to develop. You know, a 1.5 to 2 hour film or a 20-minute to 40-minute TV episode are very different from an interactive experience with a much longer and varied timescale. This is most clear when we look at what I'm going to call an engagement curve. Basically, it's just how exciting a story is over time, or in a game, how engaging it is over time. So stuff like combat, action, and set pieces, that has high engagement, and stuff like navigation, exploring, puzzles, and story-focused scenes, they have low engagement. Not because they're not engaging, but because they're not as exciting. It's more of a gauge of mood. In traditional act structure, the curve kind of looks like this, ramping up over the course of the story, peaking about 2/3 of the way through, and then trailing off into the conclusion. Now, here's me doing the same for the game's 21 maps. It's not nearly as simple, but also, keep in mind that a film's act structure is not going to be as simple as the broad version I showed before. But what's important about this is the little spikes in engagement that are sprinkled throughout the game, usually peaking around the end of each act. You've got the escape of the intro, the train yard fight and crash, the dropping of the vault. That's the kind of stuff I'm defining as engaging, alongside fights both inside and outside of the Northern Star. You see, the length of a game requires a different outlook to pacing. Even a shorter game like this is still clocking in 4 times the runtime of any other kind of traditional media, so it's got to keep hooking you in more often. You've got to actively engage with the game, which with high intensity situations is going to tire the player out, if not physically then definitely emotionally. If you extrapolate the half-hour high intensity action scenes that typically end the second act over even a short 10-hour experience, that's 2.5 hours of high intensity gameplay. Not even Doom tries to make that amount of action work, because those stretches of non-action, even if it's brief, are extremely important. But you still gotta keep it exciting. That's why the thing's all over the place. Each act is its own mini-story that escalate in intensity and length as the game goes on, starting slow and ending on a big hit of intensity. Except, of course, for Jeff. Jeff, by all senses of the word, is an outlier. It's a major tonal shift, not just from the action-oriented maps that preceded it, but also as the ending to an act, because Jeff is actually the ending to Act 3. It's a strange shift from the acts that precede and follow it, which both end with high amounts of action, and it's a decision I've questioned in the past. But what Jeff is doing is splitting the game in half. Not half as in time, there's a lot more before Jeff than there is after, but tonally the game's day and night sections definitely feel like separate halves. The game through the Northern Star up to Jeff is very goal-oriented. Find the substation, destroy the substation, get closer to the vault. These things are all pushing the game forward, but not really the narrative. After Jeff is where the narrative really starts to move forward. Captivity and Revelations are both one-map chapters about learning that the vault is a prison, or it's holding something in captivity, and about the revelation that it's the G-Man in the vault because, you know, this shit ain't fooling anyone. As the second and third acts take up a bulk of the gameplay, they are naturally more sprawling, with a lot of spacing needed to be taken up with stuff that isn't about the narrative, but instead can be used for world building, creating tone for gameplay, important things, but stuff that isn't directly contributing to the narrative being told in terms of its plot. There are a couple of things, like the substation being destroyed, but not a lot beyond that. The fourth act after Jeff is shorter and sharper, spiking both the narrative tension and the gameplay, with longer, more frequent use of combat, and Jeff is the bridge between these two sections. Jeff has nothing to do with anything. Jeff is a horror section built entirely for gameplay, completely disconnected from the goals set up previously. The game has yanked Russell away from you before, but never for this long a stretch of time. It's widely considered to be one of the best parts of the game, but that's probably because it's different from everything else. Sneaking around one unkillable enemy, completing puzzles while trying to stay quiet, nothing else in the game is like this. That's the point of Jeff in the game's structure. It's a reset point. It takes focus away from the narrative and it tells its own brief story. By doing so, it creates a subtle disconnect between what has come before and what will come later. People tend to think that pacing is about keeping things exciting, but it's actually the opposite. Well, it's more of a balance between the two, but you know, people tend to get too caught up in trying to keep the audience engaged across the entire game, but that's tiring. And a game is not normally played through over one sitting, so you've got to keep it slow for a while. Just like how slower sections are used to space out the combat and set pieces, Jeff is doing the same on a macro scale. It's a break between the long stretch of combat from the third act that's been building up tension pretty much since the introduction, and the much more difficult combat and payoff of the ending in the fourth and fifth acts. But there's another important difference about the medium of game design, and that's learning. A game's got to teach you how to play, the rules it operates under, and pacing is a really important part of that. Get it wrong, and you're either front-loaded with a bunch of boring tutorials, or you're thrown into the deep end with no idea of what's going on. That's why the second act is so vital to the game. The subway tunnels are effectively just a tutorial of the gameplay that will come in the third and fourth acts, just presented as a slower-paced version of the same gameplay. They don't ramp up the intensity that much. It's all quite slow and methodical. Even the first fight against the Combine is very short if you know what you're doing. With this slower pace, you take your time more, think about what you're doing, and so you're more naturally receptive to learning from your actions than you would be when it escalates in and after the Northern Star. Once you're into Act 3, you don't really need to learn any more of the mechanics, so they can amp it up a bit. Combat lasts longer here, and the breaks between get shorter. Now that you know what you're doing, they can make things more exciting because you're now equipped with the tools to handle it. The game is creating a tone, not just to have you be more receptive to learning the game's systems, but also just to have a tone. The further you get into the game, the more dire it gets, and so the way the game is paced, both inside and outside of combat, changes to compensate. A perfect example is the subway tunnels up through the Northern Star. The first part of the subway tunnels, before you get to the Combine, is built much more heavily on a horror tone. Lurking through the abandoned tunnels, it has a sense of trepidation, specifically because the combat is slow. Zombies and headcrabs are more conceptually scary than the Combine soldiers, at least on a surface level, because the Combine soldiers are fucking horrifying, but they're much more mechanically safe. They're a lot slower and they can't effectively attack at range. Most of the time. So combat with them has a slower quality. The Combine soldiers force you to think on your feet more. They're more mobile and exclusively use ranged weapons. It flows a lot faster, and so naturally it creates a faster pace. That's why the game drops the horror tone throughout the second half of the game. It can't maintain it as it amps up the engagement. The closer you get to the vault, the game shifts its tone with how it's paced to something much more proactive. Not proactive in the literal sense, but tonally you feel that more stuff is happening when the pace is up, even if in both instances the actions were narratively proactive. They still take the time to slow it down to not overload you, but it builds higher and higher until they drop a parking building and then a strider on you. And then it slows way down. That right there is what makes the ending so effective. Sure, the vault has some crazy visuals, but what makes you feel how weird it all is the change in tone, brought about by the stark change in pacing. You were just in the most complex boss fight of the entire game, and now there's no combat at all. All you have to do is walk around, and that change in pacing is really what makes it feel strange. That right there is a prime example of just how much good pacing can do, because it's not just one of the biggest determining factors on keeping a player engaged, it's also a storytelling tool. This is Half-Life Alyx's key strength. It uses its pacing not just to keep you engaged, but to also make you feel a tone. If you go back and look through the game, you might notice that combat really lasts for any more than 5 minutes. It might even seem a bit short when you analyze it, but when you look at it on a macro level, it works. Combat is short and sharp, whereas the rest of the game is quite slow and methodical, and they use that combination to create mini stories that keep you engaged. This is why Half-Life Alyx was a successful experiment. Good pacing is so extremely important, and yet I've seen so many other VR experiences miss that completely, either because they don't need it, or because they're too focused on the experimental game design that VR offers. Which is fine, but it never engages you in the same way. Look, I'll leave it at this. There is a reason I have played through this game 6 different times in full, and it's a direct result of its pacing. It's so tight, it almost feels effortless. It stays engaging from beginning to end, and that's never changed, from my first playthrough where I knew nothing, to now where I knew far too much. The game is a good VR game, simply because it's a good game, not the other way around. Its mechanics might not be revolutionary, but the solidness of its fundamental design makes it leagues ahead of any other VR experience.